Hi, this is Miss Litton, and this is my wonderful Period 1 AP Bio class for the very last chapter for the entire year. They are crying tears. I don't have enough tissue in this room. Tell your bio buddy good job for hanging in there. One last push. We can do it. All right. Okay, currently pelicans are getting saved. Saved from things like DDT. That chemicals, especially chemicals that can be stored in our fat, can move up through the food chain, right? Gets in the system, maybe in a few invertebrates. Those invertebrates get eaten by fish, some sort of vertebrate, and those get eaten by a larger organism. And each time they can't get rid of that toxin, then it concentrates in those tissues. Probably all of you have DDT in your fat tissues right now, okay? Because it's been passed up and up and up through the food chain. And so once it concentrates at a certain level, where one organism eats 10 of these things, the next organism might eat 100 of those, and it just keeps getting concentrated, and it causes problems. So we need to look at all of that, and if we're looking at all of that, that's about conservation biology. And so there's basic biology. These are classes that you might take, and then this is applied biology. If you were going to pick a job in applied biology, what would it be? Tell your bio buddy. Hi, sweetheart. All right. Did you tell him what job? Okay. So, on your notes, conservation biology defined as studies biodiversity in order to conserve natural resources, involves application of practical problems. And the premise here, okay, is that high levels of biodiversity is desirable because it positively influences the stability of ecosystems. It positively influences the stability of ecosystems. I was just reading about these. It's so interesting. It was in National Geographic. Anybody else see it? National Geographic? So cool. And they have a little heart on the mountainside. Okay, anyway, we'll talk about it later. We don't have time right now. And then this applies the science of bioinformatics, the collecting of, analyzing, and making readily available biological information using modern computers and technology. Things that couldn't be done before, where they can identify DNA sequences, that they can have that on a major database that is shared. I was looking around. This is called the European Molecular Biology Laboratory, and it's pretty interesting. They're looking and studying biodiversity and talking about the resources that they have and the ideas about conservation. With approaches that range from examining soil or ocean samples to collecting insect DNA from car windshields. Okay, they're able to take samples and get information. Moving on, data collected and analyzed from organisms off the car windshields, molecular, descriptive, and biogeographical information. And then if we're going to analyze, come here, notebook. If we're going to analyze, if we look at biodiversity, it's the variety of life on Earth, and we're looking at the number of species. And if you look, do you think we've classified all the species that are out there? No. And this is giving you an idea about how many species there are and how many are described and cataloged. And the range is pretty huge on how many species are out there. 8, 10, 13 million different species, and maybe we've cataloged 1 million of them, and most of those are in invertebrates. Now, the bigger you go up, right, the larger, when you get to the mammals, we can see them, right? So there is not like, oh, look, a new mammal, okay? That doesn't happen. But insects and then all the bacteria and fungi that are out there, we haven't even begun to classify all of them. Yes?
If we haven't classified them, how do we know how many there are?
It's based on estimates on how often maybe they find a new species. I'm assuming. Yeah, I'm assuming. So then if we looked at what is a threatened species, and threatened species are in danger of becoming endangered. So if you said, hey, you either have to be threatened or endangered, which one would you pick? I just want to be threatened, okay? Endangered is worse. Here are a list of different threatened species. in the top 10 countries, and you can see, look right here, Ecuador. Why would Ecuador have so many species that are threatened? Think about, where did we see the greatest biodiversity? We already studied this. At the equator, at the tropics, right? So that's where you have the greatest number to, so therefore, since you just have more species, then you could have more that could become threatened. And then you look to see, and I don't know if this is what you were saying, that some of the things that are happening at the equator with cutting down rainforests, and there are species that are in there that we haven't even analyzed yet. And literally, when you look at where most drugs are discovered, there are billions of dollars worth of drugs in the rainforest that we haven't even analyzed or found yet. And these could be something that could come from an organism that could save your child or grandchild's life, but we don't even have a chance to even find it because we're destroying it so rapidly. So that would be, I mean, if you're just going to be purely selfish, you want to consider it on those reasons. And Max, billions of dollars are out there that could be earned and donated to a president. And then endangered. Endangered, you're in danger of immediate extinction. So on your notes, endangered species faces immediate extinction. Endangered faces immediate extinction. And threatened species are likely to become endangered. Okay, side note. Have any of you seen the movie The Thinning? Yeah, it's stupid. You shouldn't watch it. But I watched it on Saturday afternoon. But it's about that United Nations says that you have to eliminate each population by 5%. So here in the United States, they decided the way they would do that is if on standardized tests, so you did see it. Yeah, if you were like on the bottom 5%, then you just were killed. And so test scores really improved. And you would start taking them, I don't know, like you're 7. And every year, like the kids would go in and say goodbye to their parents, like, and then they would go in and take their test. And then immediately, it was all computer driven. If you didn't get in the top whatever percentage, the bottom 5%, they'd call your name and you'd go with the soldier to go be killed. And I'm just like, oh my gosh. But now I thought, whenever we do our state test with AP exam, I'm like, the thinning, it's in a week. So that's right, the thinning of the herd. All right, sorry. Yeah, you're in danger of immediate extinction. So what's this?
No, it's a beluga.
It's a beluga whale. So we're looking at species, yes, that could be eliminated. So biodiversity is important to the health of the biosphere, and there are 3 types of biodiversity when you analyze it. There are 3 levels to it. The first one is genetic. Populations with high genetic diversity are more likely to survive a change in the structure of their ecosystem. Why? Why, if you had more genetic biodiversity, would it be better within your species? I mean, there's obvious variations within this classroom. Yes?
There's a greater chance of species surviving because there's applications for evolution, more diversity-wise, and more chances that one of those diverse traits is going to be successful.
Exactly. And by applications, you mean adaptations, right?
Yeah.
Okay, good. Yeah, if you are more genetically diverse, then if something happens to change your environment, or let's say you have a parasite or a pest of some sort, you're more likely to survive because somebody might have an adaptation that makes them better suited for this new environment. Okay, so that is the first one. I think I have a few more slides on that. I'll let Blue take the lead on this one right here. Go ahead, Blue. All right. So then our next one is, I made a little side note. It's not in your book. I'm just adding it in. If you look at the note, when a population drops below a minimal viable population, that's MVP, okay? When you drop below that, it's loss of genetic variation due to non-random mating and genetic drift due to non-random mating and genetic drift can trap it in an extinction vortex. an extinction vortex. I could see an essay. How could you have an extinction, right? So I'm always envisioning, oh, if I don't teach them this, that'll be the essay. One key factor is the loss of genetic variation necessary to enable evolutionary responses. That's a really good phrase. Evolutionary responses. Max, that's what you were saying. To environmental change, such as the appearance of new strains of pathogens. So for instance here, this is it says biotic boundary for short-term survival, MVP is 50 individuals. That really doesn't give you enough biodiversity. It would be better here, if you want to have long-term survival, you need to have 500 individuals so you can keep up the variety, okay? So I think this is a really cool diagram showing the vortex. And Slate, why don't you start right here at small population and work your way through this vortex right here. Go ahead.
So this small population, like interbreeding and inbreeding, drift to loss of variability, so loss of variety, and then reduction in individual fitness, adaptability, like more learning, and then they have more reproduction, higher mortality, higher death rate,
It's kind of like positive reinforcement of a negative thing, right? The smaller population ends up becoming even more smaller, which makes it even become even more smaller and even more smaller right into extinction. Do you see that? Okay. All right. So, and you have all of that in your notes. Okay. And next one is community biodiversity. And this can go back to blue. Go ahead. Okay, so just so you see the distinction, if I say genetic biodiversity, that's the different genes within a population. Now, when we look at communities, we want to have many different species within that community. That would be community biodiversity, all right? So on community biodiversity, diverse community compositions increase the levels of biodiversity in the biosphere. All right, and then the last one is landscape diversity. And Slate, this can be yours. Go ahead. Go, Slate, speak. It's right here. Okay, so as humans, we need food. So we could take all these different varieties of landscapes, and it could be like a meadow over here, and then a forest over here. And we could just kind of knock it all down and make it uniform, so we could farm on it, right? And you're really decreasing biodiversity because you're farming just one crop on there, right? And so landscape diversity, we want to have a lot of different landscapes available, because then you can have a lot of different communities, right? And a lot of different populations within those communities. So keeping landscape diversity is also important. So that would be studies landscape interactions. Some landscapes are so fractured it makes it difficult for organisms to move from one to another. And we have talked about that as well. Every time, like, you take a national park and you put a road through it, right? What are we doing to that particular ecosystem? Yeah, we're splitting it, we're fragmenting it. So fragmented landscapes reduce reproductive capacity, food availability, and affect seasonal behavior. And it has a lot to do with what's called the edge effects, because now instead of just having an edge along the outside, I've got an edge down in the middle, and I have a little bit more for you on that in just a minute. So biodiversity is not distributed evenly. So the idea would be protect those that have the greatest biodiversity, and there are biodiversity hotspots, and you can go and look to see what areas are most threatened, and why hotspots matter. Okay, we'll donate later. Okay, so if you look right here, targeted investment in nature's most important places. So there are places on Earth that are both biologically rich and deeply threatened. For our own sake, we must work to protect them. Just skim through the words that are on the board real quick. So it's kind of focusing our resources on the hotspots that have the greatest biodiversity, where we can have the most gains in protecting the most species. That's what you're looking for here. Okay. All right. Back to my notebook. Okay. So distribution of biodiversity, it is not equally distributed. We should focus focus areas on the greatest density. We should focus on areas. Maybe you want to throw a word in there. And those are closer to the equator. Hotspots contain a large concentration of species. Only 1.4% of the Earth is designated as a hotspot, but it contains 44% of all known higher plants and 35% of all terrestrial vertebrates. Okay, Slate, tell them one thing you've learned so far this morning. Go. All right. So now is where we're trying to say, where you're trying to get the argument put forward about why would it be important to maintain biodiversity. And so there's direct and indirect values, things that are obvious and things that are not so obvious in order to maintain biodiversity. And if it's direct, the value is apparent and often recognized immediately, and there are three: medicine, agriculture, and consumptive use. Those are the three direct values of biodiversity. So if we just look at medicinal value, like I mentioned earlier, there are so many things that are taken out of the rainforest that are used. They're not even medical, you know, like clothing and fibers or whatever, but there are things that have been discovered as sources of medicines for us. And so by eliminating those organisms that we haven't even found or analyzed yet, we're decreasing the odds that we're going to find some medicine that will help us. So for medicinal value, most U.S. prescription drugs are originally derived from living organisms. Were originally derived from living organisms. Based on past rate of drug discovery, there are perhaps 328 more drugs likely to be found in the tropical rainforest with over $100 billion value. And then C of that, some of the examples, I'm going to let Slate take care of the, is it Slate's turn or Blue? Blue, take care of the examples. Go ahead, Blue.
Leukemia, 0.3 child with leukemia is about 10 to 90%. Various antibiotics, the species of armadillo, leprosy, a cure was found, partially contaminated
Amoeba.
That keeps pacemakers for your back.
Medicinal, agriculture, and consumptive. They're listed right there under direct value on your notes. Okay, so just based on money and your own health. If money is important to you or your health is important to you, you should maintain biodiversity. Just selfishly for those reasons. Okay? Number two is, oh, I think I have like, oh look. And what did we see about the armadillo? They contracted human leprosy, and from that they were able to find a drug to combat that. Okay? Number two is agricultural value. So wheat, corn, and rice crops are uniform. When they're devastated by pests, the wild strains, the genetic biodiversity they came from can be and are a source of genes for a disease-resistant strain. This goes back to what we were talking about before. When something comes upon us, and if it, you know, you look at the Irish potato famine, right? They had one strain. So a fungus is, was it a fungus? It was a fungus, the blight on the potatoes. Then, or was it a mildew? I can't, it doesn't matter. Anyway, it wiped them all out. All of a sudden, that was your food source, your main food source. Now you have nothing to eat. So we want to maintain biodiversity because we grow these crops now that are real specialized to maximize yield, and so we just keep growing those same ones over and over again. Well, eventually something's going to come along and adapt on how to just, eat that or consume that. And we want to have in our back pocket some other genes to use to create other strains. Then, let's see. Oh, look, here's a wheat field. Wild species like biological pests controls are economically important replacements when pests are pesticide resistant. So we can get other organisms. If we don't maintain biodiversity, then we don't have these organisms available to take care of things that might attack our crops. Another one here, like a bat is a pollinator, and we want to make sure to keep the biodiversity there so it can continue pollinating. And we've had this discussion before about bees and the big concern about colony collapse disorder. Have I shown you this slide before? This right here is a mite. Do you see that little red dot? That little red dot there. And in 2010, scientists reported a possible cause of colony collapse disorder, CCD, the rapid die-off of millions of honeybees in many countries since 2006. One culprit is thought to be the blood-sucking varroa mite. It remains the honeybee's most devastating pest worldwide. And we know if we don't have honeybees, then we're not going to have any what? Well, it's not honey that we're concerned about. We're not going to have any what? Food. Yeah, food. Food. Okay. So you can see on the notes there, domesticated bees pollinate over $10 billion worth of food crops annually, and these mites have wiped out over 20% of the population. Any hope of a resistant breed depends on the wild bees, so we need to maintain that biodiversity. Okay? And then last but not least is consumptive value. The cultivation of crops and the domestication of animals have been successful. Many trees are felled for their wood, but in some cases, like Peruvian Amazon, rubber trees can provide a product indefinitely if kept alive. So if you could keep the tree alive, you can actually make more money off of it by getting the rubber out of it than just getting the short-term use of the wood to build something out of it. Okay, so we need to analyze all of those things. Blue, tell them one new thing you have learned about direct values of biodiversity. Go.
To direct, yes. See?
All right. Sometimes addressing our fears helps those fears to be eliminated as we look at them and stare them down. So why don't you share a fear, log in as a fear, and then discuss that with your bio buddy. Log in as a fear, and then discuss it with your bio buddy. You can log in too. Okay.
Really? Failure.
You're afraid of Gabby? Roller coasters.
Why is this loading? Oh my God. Here, I'll put a I don't want you to see it in there, okay?
You know, I'm thinking biodiversity, genetic diversity, makes me think that America could be good if we had a lot of genetic diversity in our country.
First of all, all the other same thing. Second of all, we have
Look around the room. We don't look the same. So easy to just dial up. I love it. Take a switch.
Do not. Stop. Grace, I'm not kidding. I'm going to kick you off this. I'm going to unshare with you if you do that. Do not.
You're part of the alt-right. You want to celebrate white privilege.
Oh my God. With this question, I'll show.
Lizzie, I need a shirt. I like brown people.
Please. I need that shirt. What are you talking about?
I like brown people. Please let them stay. Let's get a shirt.
I like brown people.
Yeah. We need to make shirts. AP Bio 2017.
I'll make them for us.
Of course you will.
Of course I did. You know everything.
The Filipinos. Yeah. What do you mean you're bringing like the president here? It's okay. Don't worry about human rights. He's here today.
Why are they loading? These are golden photos.
Large sacks? You're afraid of large sacks of what?
Oh my gosh.
Okay, are we ready?
You know what, actually? Maybe.
Come on now. Bring it home. Bring it home. Especially whoever is afraid of everything. Or did you just log in twice? Liberals logged in so he could get that up there, but then he's not answering any questions on that. He logged into something else. Very interesting. Holding us up. Okay. Yeah, modern agriculture. Good. Nobody says that because it says is not characterized. Modern agriculture is characterized on needing chemicals and frequent irrigation and high fuel consumption. Because if you think about modern agriculture, first of all, you have to get the soil ready, and that usually takes machines, gas, fuel, right? Then you have to plant, machines, gas, fuel. Then you have to water and irrigate, machines, gas, fuel, right? Then you have to harvest, but though some of you may partake of farmers markets to go and get, so it's not packaged, a lot of times these things have to be the process of packaging, transporting them somewhere where they can be packaged, the plastic that has to be made in order to package them, and then shipping them somewhere else because we don't always eat locally. And if you think about that, if we ate locally, if we had, everything we needed available to us, that might change, our impact on the environment. So we do have high fuel consumption. And then 14 of you got this right. We don't have a high diversity of crop varieties. We tend to be have the one that works the best, gets the biggest, everybody plants that. And then that's eliminating some of our biodiversity. I get it though. If you're a farmer, you don't want to go, I'll do this second grade, this lower level, because you might not make the profit. I get it. I understand. Yeah.
Can't like GMOs to I guess genetically modify potatoes to stop?
Yes.
Actually plants.
Well, anything's available because life is always going to persist, right? And especially in viruses are always going to mutate. So things are always changing. And that's the same thing about the concerns about antibiotics, right? We can have all these great antibiotics, but those things that have very short lifespans, things that work out of the J-shaped growth curve, that are, those colonizers and trying to get, they will keep mutating at a very quick rate in order to survive, right? So we're always fighting that. Always fighting that. Okay, so now let's talk about indirect. Oh wait, sorry, there was another question there. My bad. Coming back. Oh, this is tricky. So the value of wild pollinators in the U.S. agriculture economy has been calculated to be billion a year. What is the implication? And that was a map question, but it wasn't really a map. Did anybody pick A? Oh, somebody did. Society could easily replace wild pollinators by domesticating various types of pollinators. Do you think it's easy? If it was easy, we would be doing it, okay? And I've talked to you about that before. Literally, guys with bee trucks are hauling them, and they can't meet everybody's need. If we could make those pollinators, believe me, we would. Okay, so that's a difficult task. Pollinators may be valuable, but that doesn't mean any other species also provide us with. Okay, that's not your point there. If we did away with all natural ecosystems, we wouldn't be dependent on them. Okay, great. And we would have death. Hopefully nobody picked C. No, 5 of you did. No, 6 of you did. Great. Society doesn't always appreciate the services that wild species provide naturally and without any fanfare. Do you think at this point you could make an argument? Could you make an argument and support it on why we need to maintain biodiversity just based on direct values?
Yes.
Okay. So, and I don't know that you could do that before you walked into class today. Okay? And so the idea is we need to educate more people about the value of biodiversity so when they're making decisions, they think about it in line with those, right? Okay. So now let's look at some indirect values of biodiversity. And whose turn is it, Slate or Blue?
Blue.
Blue, go. Blue, go. Blue. Oh, dang it. Okay, so I have a little list of indirect values. We're just going to go through them very rapidly. So our natural cycles that we've learned about the carbon cycle, the nitrogen cycle. What other biogeochemical cycles have we learned about?
Phosphorus.
Phosphorus, what else? Water. Nitrogen? Oh, okay, I couldn't remember that. All right, so biogeochemical cycles, they contribute to the water, carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles that we depend on for fresh water, etc. Okay, waste disposal. So phytoremediation is a big thing. And this is where you use plants to remove toxins from the soil. You can harvest those plants. Sometimes, for instance, if there's too many nitrates in the soil, you get a plant that needs a lot of nitrates in order to grow, and you grow them there, and they remove those toxins for you naturally, which would be easier and more economical than putting one other chemical in there in order to do it. You have it done naturally. So waste disposal is one. Do I have any notes on that one? Yes, decomposition in nature is more economical and complete. Okay, provision of fresh water. By maintaining forests, forests are like sponges that hold the water and re-release it. So we would want to maintain them. And the word you're looking for there, most terrestrial organisms need fresh water, and forests are sponges that hold and release water over time. Another indirect value is prevention of erosion. Intact ecosystems naturally retain soil and prevent erosion. Slate, tell them about deforestation. Go ahead.
Deforestation results in silt that fills up hillsides in the Philippines, swimming their $100 million mangrove ecosystem protecting the ocean from oysters and all sorts of plants.
So it would be valuable to keep the plants there and avoid erosion, because especially if you're near a waterway, that silt goes in and it can affect things like coral reefs. And if it affects the coral reefs, then you don't have the fish that live in the coral reefs, and then you don't have the organisms that eat the fish. So it sets off a chain of events that you don't immediately see the value or importance of. Max, you had your hand up?
Yeah, you said like natural, like something's gonna be natural. What constitutes being natural?
I guess a really good example, and it's in your book too, it would be like the estuaries, the natural cycling of estuaries, and the role that they play. And what we end up doing is going, well, it's not helpful for me and my crops right now to have this water in here, so I'm going to dam this area up or decrease the water to the estuary and put it to my crop over here because I want to grow blah, blah, blah. And then we don't have the natural cycling occurring in that estuary, and there's so many other benefits that sometimes we don't even realize if it functions naturally on its timetable, a natural timetable. Okay, another one is climate, regulation of climate. Trees provide both shade and natural air conditioning. Globally, tropical rainforests act as a sink for carbon dioxide. When trees are burned, the carbon dioxide is released back into the atmosphere. And also now you don't have another way to remove the CO2 from the atmosphere. Okay, and then another one is ecotourism. In the United States, 100 million people spend a total of $4 billion a year on fees, travel, lodging, and food in order to enjoy natural environments. And I gave you a bunch of activities right there. this goes right back to that other site, so I'm not going to go back. Biodiversity and natural ecosystems. Studies have shown that biodiversity can maximize resource acquisition and retention in an ecosystem. Minnesota grassland habitat. More species of grasses had greater ecosystem performance. In a forest, a more complex, more diverse ecosystem had greater rates of photosynthesis. Ecosystems with the greatest biodiversity can better withstand environmental changes. If you're looking at maximizing resource potential, it always works better if there's greater biodiversity. If you're just looking at that. Not only maximizing what you get out of it, if you're just going to be selfish about it and just think about yourself on that, maximizing what you get out is better if there's greater biodiversity, and also greater biodiversity is able to withstand changes better. Changes that oftentimes we are imposing upon that ecosystem. Okay. Whose turn is it, Slate or Blue? Blue? Tell them one thing you've learned. Go ahead. One new thing you've learned. Go. Okay, and let me just make a point about this. It is hard as individuals when we think of what's right in front of us. My job. I'm a coal miner, right? So that's my job. That's how you pay for your mortgage. Okay, so that's the here and the now. Is there any such thing as clean coal? Now that's a huge misnomer, okay? Coal is dirty no matter what you do with it. So what happens is people try to package things up like it's okay, or they think about what's right in front of them. They don't think of what's good for the long term. It's looking down the road and looking at the long-term health benefit and what you need to do. Do I care about a coal miner? 100% I care about a coal miner. That was my job and my livelihood. But I would look, what can we do to help provide? Where are we spending money where we could give that to the coal miner? You know, maybe not take so many trips to Mar-a-Lago. I don't know, but there are options there. Go ahead.
You mean spending money on coal mining?
What?
Max, do you want to kill the bees?
Yeah, Max, are you trying to kill bees?
We need fossil fuels. It's better to get it here than go to the Middle East and give them money.
No doubt. I'm not arguing there, but what I would say is let's research the alternative fuels. And just think of, if we just save fuels on, let's say, the $2 million it takes us to move somebody really important from one state to another state overnight, every weekend, we could literally subsidize all the people who depend upon coal as their job. Just 3 weekends.
But then we wouldn't have coal anymore.
Right, we would have to find another source. I agree with you. And you know what they do in Europe? Less driving. You know why? If it costs $8, right, a gallon, you'll decrease your driving, right? But we are a very large country and we travel great distances. So I agree, these are all things we have to discuss. How do we handle that? That needs to be the discussion. We're going to run out of fossil fuels because it's a fossil, okay? So we're gonna run out of it. It's in the name. It tells me there's limited supply. Okay, I think some people are logged in twice, so let's go in on this. Oh, good. Most of you got that. Yeah, it didn't. But could you tell it was a map?
No.
Yeah.
It's the box.
Yeah. So sometimes the ecosystems, it's unseen, and I agree. They are noticed particularly once it is disrupted, and we should be knowledgeable about them in order to protect them. All right. So now we made the argument for biodiversity. So then our next question should be is, okay, great, I understand direct and indirect values of biodiversity. What is decreasing biodiversity? So that is our next topic, okay? What reduces biodiversity? Well, extinction, right? Does that make sense? Kind of like we want a lot of different species, okay, we're killing them. What is the number one decrease in biodiversity. Do you know what the number one for extinction? What causes extinction the most? It's right there now. Yep, habitat loss. It's the number one cause of species extinction is habitat loss. Okay, so take a look here. Is this what you would have predicted? Now, mind you, this adds up to more than 100% because sometimes you could have habitat loss and overexploitation combined together to cause that particular extinction. But this is telling you percentage-wise how many of these different things. I would tell you in an uneducated way, I would probably say pollution might be, right? And people will talk about it. Yes, is pollution a contributor? Yeah, to how much extinction approximately? Yeah, in the 20s, right? The one that we're more concerned though is about habitat loss, and look what number 2 is. Exotic species. Now you know how fine-tuned ecosystems are. So if I bring a species that has not evolved with everyone else, and I drop them in the middle, they have no natural competitors, they have no natural predators, then they can just grow, and then out-compete the ones that have been there competing all along. And so this is one that we really have to work on, that we can have a big impact. Because how much is it involved approximately, just looking at this? How much?
45.
Yeah. So you're in the 40 percentile of contributing to extinction. So that's something we need to be very careful of, and obviously pollution, and we'll talk about overexploitation as well. So number 1 on there is habitat loss, involved in 85% of causes of extinction. 85%. Slate, this is you.
Destruction of habitat, an example is the clearing of tropical rainforests, where it's estimated that half of the species are going to live. So like literally half of all.
Max, my dear.
Oh, yeah. Is habitat loss directly linked to like humans, or can I just lose our habitat naturally?
You could lose your habitat due to, let's say, climate change, which could indirectly be facilitated by humans. But probably it's because we're decreasing habitat because of either needing to house people or house plants for food.
So before, I guess, like modern humans started doing what we do now,
Right.
species still went extinct, right?
Oh yeah, obviously. Like you have a comet or a change in climate. Yeah, extinctions happen. The problem is we facilitate them so much faster because we can change a habitat like this, where it could take hundreds of thousands of millions of years to cause that change. We can make it happen right away. And in my example I would give to you is, if one of you goes on to be a billionaire and you go and you think back and you go, oh my gosh, I loved biology. Look at little old lady Lytton, and I'm going to go buy her a condo on the beach. I'm not going to say to you, no, I could never. I'll be like, yes, okay? I'm moving in tomorrow. However, all of those condos on the beach are contributing to coastal degradation, right? But am I going to turn one down? No. Okay? If you have the opportunity to live there, you don't go, oh no, I'm going to buy this really expensive land, I'm going to tear down the condo and make it a corridor for animals to move through, okay? Chances are nobody's going to do that because I'm thinking about myself right now. I would love to live on the beach. Hashtag awesome sauce. Because I'm thinking about myself and I'm thinking, what difference can I make? So this is where maybe you need a federal government to look out, like for the EPA or something like that, to go, okay, for the greater good, we need to buy this land and set it aside, because individually we tend not to make those kinds of decisions, right? I want that on the beach. Yes?
So could it then be argued that any building that humans ever build will affect the environment in like a really negative way?
I guess you could say this school building is here, so now you can't have a kit fox here. I agree. I agree with that. But I guess what it is thoughtful planning to live more in like homeostasis with the natural environment. I guess would be the deal there.
Isn't anything we do that is like living in climate?
I'm not really sure what do you have an agenda with that one?
No, I'm just wondering.
I don't have a problem with agendas. Will man interfere with other organisms?
Like,
Yes, every time. Right. Do I think man should be eliminated too? No, we're a species too. We have the technology to outcompete unfairly other organisms though. That's probably what I would say. All right. Now, and here is my condo on the coast that you got for me like in Newport. You know, I'm just saying, near a golf course. Okay, so habitat loss, I gave you some examples there. Let's go to exotic species. Exotic species are involved in nearly 50% of all cases of extinction. Nearly 50%. Oh, I'm a highlighter. Okay, so pet pythons were released in Florida, and they can grow up to 20 feet long and weigh up to 250 pounds. I don't think anybody in this room weighs 250 pounds. And they will eat anything, deer, bobcats, and endangered. I'm sorry, if you can eat a deer and a bobcat, you can eat a baby. Okay, these pythons. A decade ago, only a few. Now there are over 100,000 of these pythons because somebody let loose with their pets. But there were no natural predators. They did not evolve here. And they're out competing and killing off the native species. And literally they have, they pay you money if you come back with dead pythons because they're trying to get their numbers down. You have the clownfish off the coast of Florida. During a hurricane and a aquarium, they got out of the aquarium because of the flooding, and now the clownfish is killing off all the native species, okay, and decimating the coral. And so there are issues, I don't know if they have coral there, but they're decimating those environments because they didn't have to learn how, they didn't evolve up with everybody else. So there are broken barriers. One is through colonization. Pioneers brought different species here, and they bring it from like their native countries. Horticulture and agriculture. This is kudzu right here that came from Japan, and it was brought with a noble purpose. The purpose was, let's prevent erosion, and this plant takes, is really good. And we'll let it fill in this hillside so we won't have erosion. Problem is, it outcompetes every other plant, and it doesn't stop just where you're trying to prevent erosion. It will grow everywhere and wipe out those native species. And then accidental transport. That's why they will, like certain fruits and vegetables, like if you go to Oregon, you have to throw, if you have any fruit or anything in your car in case you might bring, is it a fly? What is it? You don't know. Anyway, when you travel, you can't just bring things back. If you go up into some natural preserves or rainforests, they have you clean your shoes first. Has anybody ever had to do this? You have to put your shoes through a special solution, so in case there's something on the bottom of your shoe, some bacteria you brought from hiking here, and then you packed your shoes, unpacked them somewhere else, and all of a sudden now, it's like you have little inoculation shoes that are dropping this bacteria and that was in the soil of your hiking shoes in this other place that could then outcompete or decimate or cause disease. So that would be an example of accidental transport. Ships, especially, things that adhere to ship bottoms, and a ship comes from one part of the world to another part, and they can accidentally transport that. So exotic species, if you look, I gave you a 1 and a 2. Slate does the 1, blue does the 2. Go ahead. Under exotic species, slate does 1 define, blue does barriers. Go.
Species listed as exotics are used or accidentally deliberately into new ecosystems. Natural ecosystems that develop with their native organisms.
Okay, so this is what I was talking about, the kudzu. And alien species, and these are all pictures of non-native alien species that are causing damage. Alien species can cause disruption to habitat, and ultimately we looked at how we looked at the food webs and how they're linked together, and you end up eliminating one. It can have a ripple effect on several other species. There was an example where they were trying to increase food source for salmon, and so the opossum shrimp was introduced into Montana lakes as a food for salmon. Instead, the shrimp competed with salmon for zooplankton as a food source, and outcompeted them, even though they were brought in for food for the salmon. The salmon, the eagle, and the bear populations all declined. Look at this. If you look at this graph, the salmon is in gold, the bald eagles are in blue, and then the opossum shrimp is in red. So no opossum shrimp, here are the numbers, and they're like, oh, we want to make things better for you, so let's introduce the opossum shrimp. So they brought them in, and then what absolutely declined? The salmon, the eagles, because that exotic species, again, brought in for a noble purpose, ended up impacting the entire ecosystem. And then islands are especially susceptible, because islands being so isolated, the species that evolved there, it would be very difficult for some other organism to, unless it was purposely introduced or brought in, to get onto those islands. And this horrible case, they were too many rats on the island, so they brought in mongooses because mongooses like to eat rats. Well, the problem is the native birds in Hawaii, because there's nothing that was preying on them, their nests are on the ground. So now the mongooses are here, and they're like, rat or chicken? Because they're going to eat a bird. Well, they preferred the native birds. So now they still have a rat population, but they've decimated all the birds in Hawaii because they're not adapted to mongoose, because a mongoose was brought in. Okay? Yeah, Operation Cat Drop. So islands, again, are especially sensitive. So on your notes, islands are especially susceptible to disruption by the introduction of exotics, and I gave you the mongoose example. Already went there. All right, pollution. Pollution is involved in 24%, and pollution can also lead to disease, which is another one. Pollution is any environmental change that adversely affects the lives and health of living things. And I have 5 different pollution items in here, and we are going to ping pong back and forth on those because you have most of the notes. I'm going to fill you in on the words, and then you're going to ping pong back and forth as I change the pictures. So to enable you to do that, go to number 2, eutrophication, and your word that you're looking for there is excess. On number 3, ozone depletion, the word you're looking for there is absorbs. And on number 4, the word you're looking for is mimic. Not it. Just decide who's going first or second. Look at me. Last push. Okay? This could be an essay question. You never know. So you want to get this locked in. Okay? So I'll go through the different pictures and you ping pong back and forth. Go. Acid deposition. So acid deposition, we have to be concerned about automobile exhaust and sulfur dioxide from power plants, and acid deposition causes trees to weaken, kills small invertebrates, and decomposers. Eutrophication is the next one. Lakes are stressed by excess nutrients from sewage treatment and agricultural runoff. Algae grow in abundance and die off. And the bacterial decomposers use up all the oxygen and kill the fish. The next one is ozone depletion. And the ozone shield absorbs most of the harmful UV radiation, preventing it from reaching the Earth's surface. With ozone depletion, we get too much UV radiation, and it causes depression of the human immune system, impaired crop and tree growth, and death of plankton. Next one is organic chemicals. You guys, here's a pullout for organic chemicals. Here you go, keep talking. A wide variety of chemicals that are produced and enter the environment. They mimic the effects of hormones. And then there's an example here. Okay, so I'm going to jump in here on this one. Why would this be bad for salmon to lose ability to switch between fresh and salt water? When does that become important? Mating, yeah, because they've got to go from salt water back into fresh water. Okay, keep going. You should be on global warming now.
Refers to an expected increase in the average temperature in the first 20% of the greenhouse gases.
So the basics, it refers to an expected increase in the average temperature in the 21st century due to greenhouse gases. And it appears that our global climate, our temperature appears to have risen since the Industrial Revolution. And as the oceans warm, glaciers would melt and sea levels would rise, and regions of suitable climate for species would shift rapidly, probably faster than plants could migrate. Causing coral reefs to be bleached out as well. Okay, so come back to me. So global warming, so as a result of pollutants in greenhouse gases in the air, right? So as a result of global warming, temperatures changes, which affects habitats, and as a result, certain organisms can't live in that habitat anymore, and the habitat ends up becoming what as a result of that? Smaller. Some other habitat's going to get larger, right? But that habitat's going to get smaller, which is what we said was the number one. So that's why some of these things, it's pollution and habitat loss combined. Okay, now let's talk about overexploitation. So on overexploitation, I'm an ocelot. You people overexploited me, and you are the cause of my mass extinction, just for the economic value. The ocelot is very disappointed in you. Me too. Us too. Okay, so on overexploitation, it's defined as when the removal of individuals from the wild populations drastically reduces their numbers. Drastically reduces their numbers. And feedback. Rarity causes a positive feedback cycle. The fewer the specimens left, the more money you can get them for them, the more you hunt them. Now there's even fewer species, so they're hunted even more because there's more money for them. So this is a positive feedback system which ends up eliminating them. And then I gave an example. Blue, take care of the example about the cacti. Go ahead.
Cacti to Celtic gardeners, parakeets, aquaculture, pet stores, tropical saltwater fish. Harvested using dynamite and cyanide, they kill many fish. Basically, they're like, just go to where I am.
All right. Okay, so let's keep going. Fish stocks. Fish stocks are being depleted by overfishing. And you have these huge nets that are dragged across the ocean floor. Okay, so here's the ocean floor before dragging, here's after dragging. Why do you drag? It's like dragging a chain link fence across the ocean floor. What is that going to do to that particular ecosystem? Destroy it. What does it benefit by dragging it?
Greater fishing.
Yeah, it stirs up all the fish. Everybody's swimming, makes them easier to capture. There's also something called purse seine fishing, okay, where you put out a net, a huge net. This is kind of like in Nemo. Swim down, right? So everything gets brought up. The problem is, if you're adapted to this depth and you get brought up to this depth, you can't, you've heard of divers, they don't want to get the what? Starts with a B. The bends, right? It's when you don't give them enough time, you know, for it to equilibrate. And that can affect your gases in your blood and how fast it comes out. Remember how we talked about that gases need to be dissolved, right, into your blood? And you have CO2 sits as what? Bicarbonate, right? Remember that? And oxygen binds to hemoglobin, right? And so when you start removing organisms from their environment, you go, oh, this one's too small, I can't keep this one. They go to throw it back, but it doesn't make any difference. It's already going to be what? Dead. Yeah. Or if you're harvesting the largest specimens, because that gives you the most money, if some organisms don't reproduce, if they're old, like turtles don't reproduce till they're really old. Well, those are the ones they want to harvest. And so then you end up depleting their numbers because you're taking away the ones that could actually contribute to increasing their numbers. And then you start that whole positive feedback loop. Oh, now they're more rare, so now they're worth more money, so now we want to harvest even more. And we get them into that, remember we talked about, what was that? Vortex, exactly. That vortex of extinction. So, I already gave you that one, and you have a highly suggested reading and thinking, which could be on your exam on Wednesday. Overexploitation of the Asian turtle. So, tell your bio buddy, have you done that one yet? Tell your bio buddy. Now, are you to abdicate your learning and give that responsibility to somebody else in your team? No, you're all supposed to contribute, right? All right. Fifth main cause of extinction is disease. Now, things like amphibians are highly susceptible to changes in the environment, especially toxins. Why? They sit in the water. And what else are you going to tell me? Their skin, they can absorb it right through their skin, right? So disease is involved in 3% of all extinctions due to encroachment of humans on their habitat. Wildlife have been exposed to new pathogens from domestic animals. New pathogens from domestic animals. All right, whose turn is it to say what you've learned?
Blue.
I don't even trust you, Jake. Somebody else? Blue. Okay, Blue. Blue, please. I know every single time you say the same answer, so no, you're not to be trusted. Blue, tell him two things you've learned, and Slate, you tell him one thing you've learned. It has to be different from what Blue learned. Go ahead.
We've talked about this before. Are you stopping me? Stop, please. Let him live. I know. This is our last GSM ever. Like, I'm not able to highlight. Disgusting.
Guys, this is our last box of all times. Our last one. You're gonna miss me when I'm gone.
No, you guys, you can guys know. Can you just like write it? Like give the size of the box here.
Yay! You got 100%. Yay! All right. So, one. So let's talk about where we've been in this presentation. Okay. We talked about conservation of biology. We talked about types of biodiversity. What were the types of biodiversity? Genetic, landscape, community. Excellent, Jake. Okay? So those were the types of biodiversity. Then we said, well, what's the value of biodiversity? So we talked about direct value. What were the direct values? Money, money, money. Okay, but through what?
Economics.
Medicinal. What else? Agricultural. Consumptive. Okay? Medicinal, agricultural, and consumptive. Those are the direct values of biodiversity. So we established what is biodiversity, then the direct values, and then we had several what? Indirect values. Let's name some indirect values. Biogeochemical cycles. What were some other indirect values? What? Waste disposal. Fresh water, climate, right? Those are all indirect values. Then we said, okay, so now we know what biodiversity is, and now we know direct and indirect values of biodiversity. What is decreasing biodiversity? And we said, well, extinction is decreasing biodiversity. What was the number one cause of extinction? Habitat loss. What was number two?
Species exotic.
Non-native species, exotic species. What was number 3? Pollution. What was number 4? Over exploitation. What was number 5? Disease. Okay, so we said those 5 things are the major contributors to decreasing biodiversity. This last bit that we're talking about now is, what are you going to do about it? Okay, we know what biodiversity is. We know direct and indirect values. We know what's decreasing it. So now what are we going to do? That's conservation biology in a nutshell, is what are you going to do about it? So, Slate, go ahead.
We're not changing the conditions faster. We are the traits can evolve to cope with the condition. Evolving species might not have natural resource capabilities.
Okay, so what can we do about it? There's 2 things. Preserve the habitats we have, don't let them become any worse, and then restore the ones we've screwed up, right? So when we say the number 1 cause of extinction is habitat loss, preserve what we have, fix the ones we've screwed up. That's how you go about solving this problem. So under habitat preservation, the first thing we want to talk about is you want to talk about those exotic species. We want to preserve in those areas that are the hot spots, right? We already talked about that. And there are things called keystone species within those hot spots, okay? And the keystone species is kind of one that the whole ecosystem kind of hinges on, and whether they're there or not. And blue, this is your turn. Compare and contrast, okay? This is a food chain before the killer whale involvement in the chain, and here's the food chain after killer whales started preying on otters. So look what happened over time. Go ahead. Compare left to right. Okay, do you think kelp beds are important in the ocean?
Yes.
Yes. Kelp beds are like the what of the ocean? Grass, forest, right? Habitats for a lot of species. Okay, so sea urchins prey on the kelp bed. Okay, who preys on the sea urchin to keep them in line? Otters. So by depleting the otters, now you don't have as many of the otters to eat the sea urchins, so the sea urchin number goes up, and as a result then you have less kelp beds and all the life that they support. Okay, so a keystone species is one that plays a critical role in maintaining the homeostasis of that ecosystem. So defined, influence the viability of a community. Although their numbers might not be high, if they become extinct, it will lead to other extinctions. Slate, give them some examples right there, under B. That should be dung, not dunk. All right. So another one, and I don't have this list on here, there's keystone species and then there's flagship species. If you look at something that people can buy into, you know, some species that's cute or beautiful, and if you can use that because people will be like, oh, let's take care of him, and by taking care of him, you're taking care of his entire ecosystem that he lives in. So use that in order to preserve. Metapopulations. This is similar to phloem. Remember how phloem, the pressure flow hypothesis, that sugars are going to go from where they're generated or stored, from the source to the sink where they're getting consumed or stored. We talked about that. Same thing with populations. So you want to be careful that you don't take populations where it's a source and turn it into a sink, okay, where there's fewer and fewer and fewer of them. So that is metapopulations are fragments of larger populations and subdivisions. The source, higher rate of birth rate than death rate. That's their R, right? Their R would be positive. And a sink is the death rate equals to or greater than the birth rate. And you try to prevent species from migrating to a sink habitat. So this is interesting. Fowler's toads. This is Mrs. Fowler's great uncle that they were named after. No, I'm not serious. Just kidding. But I know. They were studied in Ontario, Canada, and Slate, go ahead and talk about them right here.
So, Fowler's toads, source population, visual habitats, has higher birth rate and death rate. Sink population, death rate equal to a rest bed. What are we talking about here? Just the internet source.
All right. Then landscape dynamics, some species like the grizzly, they move between several different ecosystems. They're not contained just in one neat little box. So we can't look at just maintaining this one because it also migrates over here and migrates over here and migrates over here. So you have to maintain all of those areas. So landscape preservation, try and save interconnected, diverse ecosystems. Interconnected, diverse ecosystem. And landscape preservation for one species is often beneficial for many species. And Blue, could you please talk about the edge effects? Go ahead, Blue.
Okay, the edge of the habitat is different than the interior. The smaller the path, the more edge. The edge can increase cane animals because they extremely
Now, Slate, apply edge effects to islands and this picture right here. What's going on here? Go ahead. So the depth of the edge is the same, right? So if you have a very large area, percentage-wise, then less of it is impacted. The same depth of edge is going to happen if you have a small area and you have an edge. Most of it is impacted by that edge. So that's why we want to have larger areas. And I gave you that under the edge effect. Okay. Next, fragmentation of habitat. Many habitats become separated into small pieces as wilderness areas are being split from each other by roads, buildings, and projects. So that's why they talk about those corridors, that in order to link the different areas, to have that safe migratory pathway there. And you can see some things that become obstacles for that, so that fish can't migrate back to their breeding area. So, for instance, if you keep having the cattle cross in that one area and you don't create like a bridge for them, then that can end up preventing those fish from getting back up into those areas. Okay, and here's fragmented areas are like islands. The smaller the area, the less biodiversity it can support. Fragmented areas prevent some organisms from finding food as migration patterns are disrupted. Okay, gap analysis. This is kind of going back into bioinformatics, and be specific about it, be targeted about it, and look to see what can get you the greatest gains. What are your numbers that you have to maintain? This is kind of applying foraging theory to biodiversity maintenance. All right, you need to, if you look, you need to do these population viability analysis. How many do you need? How much space do you need? How much land do you need in order to help them have a successful colony? And then this brings us to habitat restoration. The goal, seek scientific ways to return ecosystems to their former state. Can you grasp now, maybe you could before as well, if you don't understand the science between how these organisms work, and the interdependence they have through their different food webs, then you can't solve the problem very well. So we need people who have a greater understanding of it, because you just get somebody who just happens to be a fisherman and they don't understand all the ecology around it, they might think they're doing something good and noble, like bringing the kudzu, right? That's a noble thing. Bringing something to wipe out the rats, that's a noble thing, but you need to make sure you do the studies to look at the impact when you're trying to do these this restoration. Okay, so scientifically apply that. So some principles. Slate, go ahead and discuss the principles of habitat restoration. Go ahead. And then you can fill in your notes on those as well. And C is restoration should focus on sustainable development, where the resulting ecosystem can support itself. That's the whole thing. You want it to support itself, not that man has to keep investing in it. That's the idea of teaching somebody how to fish than just providing them with fish, right? You want to make that able to sustain itself. And your example here is in the Everglades, and I believe you have a highly suggested reading or thinking on, maybe you did. So there were natural wet and dry cycles. Now it's man-made cycling. We're determining when it's best for us to do cycling. Like, oh, we're going to do a lot of watering during this time, so we'll let the runoff go now. What's convenient for us. But we need to return it to the natural seasonal flow and change how we're doing our crops. Was that last chapter that there was one on that? A highly suggested reading and thinking? Do you remember? You don't remember. Okay. You do not recall? And let's look at some organisms that were saved. I was saved. Me too. Thanks, Endangered Species Act. My species has recovered too. Now, when you have them up here, if you're saving a keystone species, right, you end up saving so many other species as well.
Oh, Jesus.
Hearts. Okay, and have a piece of toast.